All right, let's jump in. So we left it with Peterson telling the story about the the encounter with the thing that you fear, allowing you to expand, right? And how our ideas die, so we don't have to, right? A lot of these ideas, we're into maps and meaning lectures, we'll say, right? And he's just expanding on them and using the purely biblical story to do it. Now, the objection I would have here is Peterson's not at his best when he's doing biblical work, unfortunately. And this is sort of where he's sort of on the wrong side of both sides, I would say. So the people who do know their Bible well or understand symbolism well are going to be like, well, you're screwing up all this and missing all these pieces or misinterpreting or whatever. And the people that don't aren't going to listen because they already have rejected the Bible. And I think that's actually really important to realize, right? We're dealing with a situation where the skeptical individuals have started from a rejection. And so you can't just leap them back into the thing they're rejecting in this way. Now, I would argue in the past, Peterson's approach was completely different and was totally awesome, right? Because he didn't use the Bible quite so much. He more relied on the ancient mythos, coming out of Egypt, coming out of Mesopotamia, in some sense, perhaps older traditions, right? Or at least older stories that people are less familiar with and haven't already rejected. And so I don't like it when he does this move, because this move is fundamentally different, because they've already rejected the Bible, right? In spite of their, quote, cultural Christianity or whatever. And this is where things get confusing, right? Because now everybody gets wrong about this in terms of approach, not in terms of their observation. Their observation is correct. That's not the issue. The issue is they get the approach wrong, because if you don't realize they've already at some level understood but rejected the arguments, then remaking the arguments isn't going to help, even if you make them, we'll say, in a secular frame, which Peterson's very good at doing. Whereas what Peterson was doing before was not that. What Peterson was doing before, and the thing that worked, in my opinion, was he was making the argument with non-Christian mythology. Well, that's a very different thing, because they don't have objections to that, because A, they probably don't know it, and B, they probably don't have a reason to reject it because they never saw it as tyrannical in their mind. And so they haven't rejected, the king being trotted out and told he's been a bad king, or Marduk, whatever, however you want to frame that, right? They haven't wrestled with these serious ideas of what is a myth about the creator of the universe, and he gets killed and then he gets revivified, right? And so they just haven't fought that, right? Those patterns are in the Bible and all the other wisdom texts, by the way. These aren't new, right? So the question is, why reject one set over the other set? Well, once you understand that dynamic, it changes the way you need to approach the problem. That's part of my thesis. So this, I think, is an error all around, because he can't win. But he's going to piss off all the biblical people. He's going to piss off all the secularists all at once over a simple misunderstanding of what's actually happened. And he's not doing this because he's switching strategies. He's doing this because he's coming closer and closer to the Christian cultural foundation, if you want to put it that way, that he's used to. And he's trying to work his way through that, we'll say, personally. And this is where I think everything becomes a problem. Okay, one of the great problems we have is that people are trying to work things through personally. Now, the thing you're trying to work through personally may be unique to you. I'm not saying so unique that no one else will resonate with it, but what if it's so unique to you that only a handful of people will resonate with it? And you can say, well, Mark, most people go through the same sort of things. Yeah, fair enough. What if half the population is wrestling with it, but the solution for you doesn't match most of them? Now we get in, right? Because that's a more common scenario, right? One person's solution to drug addiction and another person's solution to drug addiction could be very, very different, right? Because you're unique, and so you have uniquenesses about you. Right. This is where it becomes an issue. And the reason why I think that's a bigger problem than people realize is because this is my primary observation about so-called modern philosophers. You look at Nietzsche, you look at Heidegger, you look at Kierkegaard, you look at any of them, right? You quickly look at a personal thing they struggled through in their life historically, right? You look at their biography, and then all of a sudden you actually know all of their philosophical arguments mysteriously, right? Because they have taken their personal trauma or their personal struggle or whatever and cast it as a problem in society, right? And now they're trying to fix society or culture or whatever instead of processing it themselves. That's really the trick. Sorry, I don't know why this isn't clearer to more people, but that's really all that's going on with almost all of these guys, as near as I can tell. All the ones I look into, every time I look into it, it's the same story. I don't think that's a coincidence. I think this is a very human tendency to not deal with our own problems. This is why we psychologically project, right? Project our problems out and try to fix them there instead. And then A, we don't need to change. And B, we can test our ideas without actually putting them into practice. Well, look, work for him, right? And we never do the work if we don't want to. We can have fixed the problem in our head because it got fixed out in the outside world, but didn't get fixed for us, and we don't have to change. That's fantastic. Also not good for you or the world, but hey, who's counting? So, that would be my argument against watching these sorts of things even. Like, this is dangerous. Like, this solution, this way of working things out may only work for him. I don't know that for sure, but it's always something to keep in mind. And I think we lose track of that. So I just wanted to go over that real quick, and then let's dive back in and see how far we can get.
Like, the job isn't done, obviously.
Richard, the story that we've just heard, the Old Testament bronze serpent, it's rhyming with the New Testament Christ depicting himself as that bronze serpent. I think, from Jordan, if I may, as Richard suggests, from what I've heard you say before on this same story, there's something about that harmony between that New Testament Jesus and that Old Testament story, which is so profound and so impressive that it's difficult to imagine it having sort of naive human authorship. What do you make of that story and of that assertion?
Well, it doesn't impress me. I mean, I don't understand why you would say that has... I don't think Jordan actually said it had divine inspiration. Maybe he did.
Not divine inspiration necessarily, but more than just, as I say, naive human authorship. Not like someone just sat down and wrote the story.
At minimum, it's a staggeringly brilliant literary move, especially given the fact that that relationship hasn't been explicated before.
Do you think, for example, if you were looking in Scripture for something which would identify this as a God-given text, maybe you, as a scientist, would look for some scientific information. It might have told you the shape of DNA or something like that. But do you think
which Jordan actually thinks, yeah.
Yeah, we can perhaps get onto that. But do you think that a literary brilliance of a similar kind or a similar intensity, that if the Bible is not a scientific text, you might be looking for something some scientific fact which you couldn't have otherwise known? Is it possible that some kind of genius moral move or literary move could also indicate that this is something more impressive?
You more or less asked me what would impress me, and I'm a naive literalist, and so I would say, if any prophet had said something like, the world is just one object in rotating around the sun, something like that. They never do. I mean, it's always some kind of moral lesson which leaves me cold.
Wow. This is so interesting. So we can notice a few things here. First is Alex seems persuaded by the impressive coincidence, if you will, of the concurrence between the New Testament and the Old Testament. And fair enough, perhaps you should be. Dawkins seems to reject the word divine, again, without defining it, which, is a handy trick that these people use all the time. We're just not going to define it. We're going to say, we don't believe in divinity. We're not going to say that, right? we're just going to make sure we never run into anything divine so that we don't have to believe in divinity and we can still reject the idea without having to worry about it. So Dawkins just says, I'm unimpressed by this, which is, interesting. The counter to that is, well, I'm unimpressed about the claims of evolution. And actually I am. So they're also hyped up quite a bit. They're like a lot of the things they say are just wrong, right? Like this leads to that. No, it doesn't. It's just wrong. But a lot of what we call evolutionary theory is a set of things, most of which are inferences, right? They're not experimentally possible in some cases because the time frames are too long to have a single observer, and therefore they wouldn't qualify as proper scientific experiments. They always forget to mention this somehow. It's weird how they leave that out. I'm sure it's just an oversight on their part, and some of which are just not experimentally proven, right? Most of the experiments haven't been such as they are, which again, most of evolution does not have experimental evidence behind it. Most of the ones that have been experimentally proven haven't been reproduced yet because, the replica crisis in science is real and it touches all of science, right? A lot of this stuff hasn't been replicated, and there's a replication crisis. So, are you sure? How do you counter somebody who's just a curmudgeon, doesn't want to believe? And it's interesting, right? Because, and this is where the intellectuals always trip up. They always try to anticipate things. Well, in their anticipation of things, because actually here Alex is being very careful, he intuits the fact that the core question is, what would convince you? In other words, what is your standard of evidence? Which is very important, by the way, in science. In fact, it's probably the number one most important thing in science. And Dawkins intuits that that's the question, and sort of, brushes off. Oh, you seem to be asking me that question. Like, what would I accept as impressive or something? Well, it's a good question to ask, right? What would you accept? Oh, nothing. Oh, that's why, because you've already rejected it all. And that's how you get there. Like, a lot of people are wondering, like, how did he get here? Oh, he started with a rebellion or a rejection. That's how he got there, right? The rest is downhill. That's how they all get there, by the way. I haven't seen any exceptions. They all get there with a rejection or a rebellion. That's pretty much the trick. They reject the tyrannical Christianity that they're standing on, and they are standing on it. They don't know that because they don't believe that, because they believe they're individuals and they derived it all themselves in their head by magic overnight, not from their parents because their parents were terrible or maybe they weren't, but their parents are dumb and they couldn't have derived this, right? Nothing gets passed down with these people. There's no lineage. That's why they compress the past. That's why when people knock down statues in their culture, they're like, well, maybe they have a point of evil, but destroying your history is evil, so don't do that. I don't know. This isn't that hard, but apparently, it didn't seem hard. Did that seem hard? It didn't seem hard. So, you run into this pattern, and this is the pattern. This pattern of rejection of the past. This pattern of I did it all myself. This sort of Sam Harris thing. Check out my Sam Harris videos. Right? I talked about all this there too, because it's the same nonsense. It's the same pattern. They're basically the same people. Dawkins is, I'm sorry, like none of his ideas are particularly interesting. Talk about disinterest. I couldn't finish The Blind Watchmaker. I was like, this is boring. This guy's making a lot of mistakes. They're kind of obvious, and I don't think there's anything to say. This selfish gene idea is just, the whole concept is stupid. Selfishness is a function of an agent. Genes are not agents. That's not hard. Was that hard? That didn't seem hard. Like, rejected the whole concept right there with a simple observation. And people are giving credence to these people. And I'm like, why? They're clearly not that bright. These are obvious, easy mistakes that are common. They're common, obvious, easy mistakes. They can be made by anybody, irrespective of IQ or education or memory or how many things you've stuffed into your head or how many degrees you have. Or people make mistakes like this all the time. They're easy to spot mistakes. Why are we listening to these people? I don't understand. You know, so these are the things to watch out for, because people have been fooled by this guy for decades, and there was no reason for that. You could have just paid attention and listened real carefully to what he was saying.
Well, why is it that there is no... I mean, they say that God meets you where you're at, right? And there are some people who just care about scientific truth. That's what they know. That's their profession.
Well, I
Someone like
think
Rich. Why is there not anything in the Bible for them?
Oh, I think the idea that sacrifice is the basis of the community is a remarkable and scientifically valid hypothesis. I think that it's precisely akin to the, what would you say, to the process of cortical maturation. I think they're the same thing. Because as we mature, we move farther away from the immediate gratification of our self-centered emotional and motivational needs to a ethos of care that brings our future self into the picture and a wider and wider array of other people. And I think that's associated with cortical maturation. In fact, I think the purpose of the cortex, a purpose of the cortex is to bring the dynamics of the short-sighted underlying motivational and emotional systems into the kind of harmony that allows for communal existence and the protection of the future at the same time that the present is, what would you say, cared for and attended to. That there's a kind of harmony there. There's also a pattern there. It's not arbitrary at all. And I think we know this biologically, is that the number of ways, and I think we already alluded to this, the number of ways that a society can organize itself so that each individual can harmonize their own future with the present and do that simultaneously with many other people, there's a very limited universe of possibilities there.
Richard,
Very limited universe.
Richard asked you.
So much to address. This idea from Alex that the Bible should provide something like a, quote, scientific truth. Science doesn't make truth claims. So I don't know why people are confused about this. Where did you learn that it does? Please tell me. I did not learn that in school. I learned quite the opposite. I was told over and over again. I watched numerous lectures where people said science does not ever make truth claims ever and cannot make truth claims. Cannot. So I don't know where they're getting this from. I'm sorry. I just don't know where they're getting this from. Insofar as the claims that, we'll say, somebody even like Alex gets from science exist, those are in the Bible. I don't know what else to tell you. I just don't know what else to tell you. Those are absolutely in the Bible. What you're doing is you're rejecting the authority from which those claims are given. So you might believe the authority of your biological textbook that you got in school and not the authority of the book that you got in church. Well, that's your problem. That's not a difference in the books. That's a difference in your rejection of authority. So you can see how this, again, comes down to rejection of authority, because that's what's happening here. This is a rejection of authority problem. It's not a problem of they don't know the Bible well enough necessarily, although it could also be that, right? It's not a problem of, oh, well, if only they had the right symbolic language. Nope, that won't help a rejection problem, my friend. I mean, I'm not saying it can't contribute, but like that's not going to solve this problem. It's not an issue of, oh, well, how do I reconcile different types of truths? Okay, science is super new. Like if you knew how new science was on the scene, and then you stopped time and said, all right, well, where did all the things before science come from? The scientific method in particular. And then you'd realize, oh, all the good stuff came way before science. And then if you looked forward and said, okay, well, how did we get GPS? All the technologies for GPS were available without science and without Einstein. Sorry, they were. Like, all of this is like pro-science propaganda that's just verifiably, observably incorrect. Like, science didn't do any of this stuff. Engineering did a bunch of it. A lot of it was done by inventors. You want to know who actually the world's greatest scientist is? Thomas Edison. actually. Why? Because he's the one that ran the most scientific experiments to find the most stuff that you could engineer into useful things. And he's also the most useful scientist because of that. And these guys wouldn't recognize him as a scientist. He had like a 4th grade education or something. Right. And they want to wrap science up in education. And then they want to wrap education up in some system with grades and papers and you know, to Eric Weinstein's point, gatekeepers and all this. Well, I mean, maybe you need that for some things in some circumstances and in some way. And maybe we've never worked that out. And the system we have was never very good, because that's true. But alas, I digress. And before you don't believe me, go look at the early history of something like particle physics. Okay? And they're still rebelling against particle physics. Sabine Hoffenfelder talks about this. Like, she does great work on this. Says like all the new particle physics or you know, new particle physics theories are garbage that are designed to steal money from governments and institutions. That's true. Particle physics worked out in like the 1930s or something. I might be getting that a little bit wrong, but it's back then. It's not, and it hasn't changed since. I don't know what to tell you, and it's probably not gonna. Sorry. Right? Like, just not gonna. Now, quantum physics has changed, but particle physics hasn't, and those are two different things. And right, and it's we don't need to unify them either. I don't know where that idea comes from, and we didn't throw out Newtonian mechanics just because Einstein came along, because we still use Newtonian mechanics, by the way. Like, I don't, like, where are all these fights coming from? It's all rebellion against people who did stuff by people who can't do stuff. That's the best way to look at it. It's like, oh, wait a minute. Oh, well, that's weird. Also, that's what's happening. And so, what does it mean to have a scientific truth in the Bible? It's there, dude. Sorry. Is the scientific method in the Bible? You're not using that anyway, Alex. What do you care, bro? You're not using it. Most of the people that cite most papers aren't using it because they're using non-replicated results that they're citing. Technically, they're not even using their own system. That's what's really happening here. Sorry. That's what's really happening. This is all a big illusion at some level. What is truth? Well, sure, capital T truth and lowercase t truth, apparently, all of a sudden, which I vehemently disagree with. That would destroy the utility of the word entirely. You might as well just not have the word truth. We can make up 2 new words, or 3 or 4 or 10. Who cares at that point? It doesn't matter. You might as well split it into 1,000 parts, because that's what science does. It splits everything into 1,000 parts. Dissect the frog. It's all dissection. It's all splitting in rebellion. That's all that's going on here. And that's the problem. They're not tying things together. They're not unifying them. And then Peterson, does his best, I guess, at making this argument. But the thing he's talking about cortical maturation and that relationship between that and, we'll say, the loss of the ego. Weird that he didn't use the more scientific terminology there. I mean, psychological terminology there. That's an inference. We don't know that experimentally. It's not a scientific truth. It's an inference. I get that. Inference is very powerful. Sure. I mean, that's what a lot of AI, at least in the early days, is inference, right? Inference is fantastic. That's where AI is most useful to this day, by the way. Oh, that's a topic for my other channel. Yeah, so I don't know, like, he didn't make the case. It's not, because again, they're playing fast and loose with the definition of science. They just play fast and loose with all the definitions. They're having a very floaty relativistic conversation. And you'll notice that with relativists, they are not willing to nail down terms. Because if they did, they'd trap themselves in their own mistakes. And most of what they're doing are mistakes. Science doesn't do what they claim it does. It's quite simple, pathetically simple, disappointingly simple, depressingly simple, horrifically simple, sad, but true. And that's the problem. That's the problem. So let's see how this goes. I'm already sad.
You before about the difference between a story or an idea naturally evolving over the course of numerous manuscripts and throughout human history, and the idea of it being divinely inspired. And you were seeming to imply that these are almost interchangeable concepts. Now, if that's the case, when you say that this divine spirit behind the Bible is actually just the way that it has evolved throughout the human history, throughout the different manuscripts that we've had, then saying that that is what divinity is, I think for you may drag the mundane up into the realm of divinity. But I think for people like Richard and for many people listening, what it does instead is drags the divine down to the realm of the mundane.
Very well put, yes.
Yes, very well put, Alex. Right. It just moves divinity away from higher and down to lower, right? Down to evolved, right? It doesn't solve the problem, by the way, at all. It just cheapens the word. And it makes the word, which would normally be indicative of something along akin to vertical causality, a flat word. And flat words create flat worlds. Now you know what I'm talking about when I say flatten the world. That is a flattening of the world. And this is why you get the feeling these people can't make progress. No, you can't make progress in a flat, closed world. That's all you have with science. You have a closed world and it's flat. It's material and it's closed. Sorry, you can't do anything else with it. Like, there's no way around it. It's not a problem to be solved. It doesn't have a solution. It is a limitation, a constraint of the system you're using. Systems have constraints. The scientific system, logic, reason, rationality, has constraints. Lots and lots of them that people aren't talking about. And granted, maybe some of these people can't. But you know, and this is the problem in Peterson's approach. You're not dealing with the core issue. Fine. It naturally evolved. What's natural evolution? Where's that coming from? What drives that? How did that happen? Where did it start? Is that's the same thing as saying divinely inspired right there. And people don't get it. I'm like, that's the problem. Where are you starting and where are you standing? Two very valid questions, right? And those are the sorts of questions you have to get to the meat of. And if you do it that way with the secular language of starting and standing, right, then you can make progress with these people because you don't have to use the crazy religious language that they've already rejected. They've already rejected vertical causality as such. They've already rejected Christian terminology, right? They've already rejected biblical language, the concept behind creation, the concept behind there was something here before me, the concept of there's something bigger than me, bigger than I can ever know, right? They've already rejected the concept of divinity. It's already not in the picture. And it's not that they just need to see it and then they'll see it. It's that they've rejected it. They've been there. They've said no to it already. And they're not going to turn around and say yes to be nice to you in a conversation because it's not how it works. And you can see that Dawkins is completely ridiculous about this. I'm just not going to play your game. I'm just not going to play your game. I'm just not going to play your game. I'm just not going to be impressed. Really? What are you, 4 years old, boy? Because that's what 4-year-olds do. For real. Like, I don't even know what else to say. Like, sure, why are you here if you're not going to listen to my points? And so it's fair to say Dawkins isn't listening. But there's lots of ways to, quote, not listen. And this is why things like not listening don't get to the point. He is angrily rejecting. That's a form of not listening, I guess. But it's more important that he's angrily rejecting. You can see it in his face. You can see it in his smug attitude here, where I happen to pause it. You can just see it. On the other hand, you saw Alex. Alex is sort of almost ebullient, right, and happy about his way of summarizing what he thinks is going on. And he does a great job of it, by the way. Impressed with his ability to summarize this, at least. So I guess he's got that. He's got that going for him, right? A reasonable understanding of, we'll say, both sides of this, if there are indeed sides, which, of course, talk like that flattens the world. Right? He sort of understands the two positions at play here, but they're still both flat positions. And you'll notice he's very happy at understanding the flat position. Yeah, all the science people are. This is the problem. You're dealing with a much more pernicious and larger problem than you realize.
When we think about wild...
Well, I don't know why it would drag the divine down into the realm of the mundane if we're speaking of something like the straight and narrow path of harmony between multiple modes of being. I don't think it doesn't make any difference to me whether it's the material reaching upward or the divine descending downward. I don't think there's any difference between those two things.
You don't. That's exactly right. That's the problem.
Well, I don't.
Okay. He doesn't think there's any difference. Right. And I've been over this before, right? There is a huge difference. It makes an enormous difference. And the thing is, this is the problem with the flat world. This is why your hopes for Jordan Peterson suddenly, we'll say, genuinely converting to some form of Anglo-Cathodoxy, hopefully, are way out of line. He could start going to church tomorrow. He doesn't understand the core concepts. He doesn't understand the principle. He doesn't think there's any difference between what's below and what's above. That's the difference between heaven and hell in biblical symbology. That's the difference between good and bad in biblical symbology. Like, this is a big problem. This is the flat world. This is why it's a problem. Now, as I said before, I'm okay with this move. The reason why I'm okay with this move, and I wouldn't phrase any of this stuff this way, I think, hopefully, if I were in that situation, is because the purpose of the move should be to break the frame of the flat world scientific thinking. That is what, once you crack that open, that's what leaves a space open for them to think about the vertical causality and whether or not it matters if something is coming down from above upon you or coming up from below. Because now all kinds of other things are on the table. Well, wait, if there's things outside of the flat world and they can enter my flat world because you just cracked it open, is that good or bad? Do I need to pay attention to these things? And how will I know the good things from... Oh, right. See, now you've opened up the conversation. Now, look, I'm not saying this lightly. I've done this for years. It works. Look, it's not terribly consistent or reliable. Sure, I get that. Probably not. But also, my hit rate's way better than everybody else I've ever met. So there's that, right? This strategy works really well. You have to employ it really carefully because when you break open someone's worldview, if you do it too much, you'll wipe them out. I mean, they can go actually insane. I've seen people go insane from this. That's why people scream and defend and do ad hominem attacks and scream at the sky, because you're messing with worldviews. And you can't just drop somebody out of their worldview and into nothing, which is where they'll go if you do it too quickly. So you've got to, be careful with it. But also, can crack them open. And you can use this method of, hey, I'll play in your frame and we'll bash up against your frame as much as you want until the crack appears to you, even though it will have been there all along. That valid strategy. Peterson's not doing that, though. Peterson's on a personal exploration to resolve something, thinking that these, quote, great minds, who are not great minds, Dawkins is not a great mind, in case you didn't notice, I've already kind of indicated this, is not a great mind. Sorry. But hasn't come up with anything interesting, and all of his theses seem to be wrong, by the way. Look up what he's done to medicine and how that's finally cracking, and people are realizing, hey, this is a dumb way to do medicine. Actually, there's a much better way. And a lot of that's being attributed to his PhD thesis. So there's that. That might be significant. It also might explain why he's so angry. Because he's just angry at being, quote, attacked. And I think he's being attacked on all sides by a bunch of people who believed anything that he ever said, which, I mean, again, that's kind of on you if you ask me, but I guess if he fooled you, he fooled you. Sorry. He's also wearing a tie with a symbol on it of the thing he claims to A, know something about, which, I'd argue he actually doesn't. Different argument. And B, reveres as though it's divine, because it appears to, through bottom-up mechanism, create life or something, which it most certainly is not doing. And we know this experimentally, so I'm really confused as to why anybody would be confused about that, but apparently here we are. So you kind of have to understand that the flat world means that Peterson isn't going to have this great epiphany in the way that you think, and he's not as close as you imagine. And this is also why Dawkins is so receptive here, because he's like, aha, you're stuck in here with me. And the science trick is very, very much, I know I've said this elsewhere, but I'll say it here. The science trick is very, very much, if you saw the world the way I see the world, you would agree with me very much. The minute you talk to a wicked smart person, as we used to call them in New England, about a subject, and they think that you get what the point they're trying to make, they get all happy and excited. And the level of disappointment when you bring their world crashing down because they've made a bad assumption or haven't accounted for something, and suddenly start to disagree with them in any way, shape, or form, no matter how minorly or how helpful you're trying to be to help refine their thought, is unimaginable. Like, they are really crestfallen if they think that you have all the right pieces, but you put them together in a way that isn't in concordance with the way they put them together. They get really upset, sometimes depressed, sometimes angry and screaming. You haven't seen anything until you've been to like MIT or Harvard and disagreed with somebody with a PhD about something that they're just flat out wrong about because they're missing a piece of information or they made a logical error or something, because it happens to all of us. So it's not really a big deal. I never knew what they were getting upset about. I'm like, bro, you just made a small mistake. It's cool. It happens to all of us. And they're like, wow, and they start screaming. I've seen people have, full on breakdowns. And it's really kind of frightening, actually. I thought you were an adult. You're 28 years old. I know you've been isolated in a college, doing your PhD and all that, but like, really? These things happen. And they're way worse than you can imagine. If you haven't seen it, believe me, you can't imagine it. Can't imagine. First time you see a 28-year-old have a full-on meltdown and throw a temper tantrum like a 3-year-old, it really rocks your world. And I've seen many of them. And I'll tell you, every time, I think I'm surprised every time. I really do. Because I'm never expecting it. I'm never expecting a small error or a small omission or somebody just not knowing something to cause such mental turmoil. But they really do build their mental systems with this logical reason and rationality. And they really don't have any room for that to be jiggled at all. Most of them, not all of them. And it sort of depends. Like, if they know they don't know something, they love exploration like most people. They love to go hunting, right? Hunting for ideas is hunting. They love it. But if it's something they thought they knew the conclusion of and you jiggle that, watch out, baby. You're in for a ride. And so I think that sort of explains sort of what's going on here with why you can see Dawkins is sort of relaxed and yet puzzled. Like, well, okay, then why don't you agree with me? That's what's going on in his head almost certainly right now. And I understand if you don't know this. Like, I grew up around Boston, and I lived in Boston for a while. And I lived in Brookline after that. I lived in Somerville before that. I mean, I used to walk down to MIT and Harvard and all that and talk to these people and audit classes there. And it's a whole different world from what you're used to. So I understand to a much greater degree what's going on in his head than most of the people watching him. And it's interesting the lack of introspection of the people in that group. Like, they all think that their group is fantastic and there's nothing wrong with it. And they don't see temper tantrums by people in their 20s and 30s and 40s and beyond as a bad thing. But I kind of think it's a sign of a big problem. But I guess time will tell who's right here.
You don't see the difference.
Well, look at it this way. So, for example, in this conversation, you know this to be the case. Like, there's various ways that this conversation could go sideways, right? Seriously, like, either of us could try to win. Either of us could try to demonstrate our intellectual superiority, right? Each of us could misrepresent the other. Or we could both try, and I do think we are in fact trying that, and I think Alex is helping along with that just fine. We could try to follow the thread of the exploratory truth and see if we could get somewhere. Now, I don't think there is any difference between that, by the way, and what's expressed in the biblical texts as the spirit of the Logos. That's why we have dialogue.
I'm very interested in the possibility that truths emerge through evolving manuscripts. Now, that's a very interesting idea, and it's totally different from divine inspiration. And I want to pursue it because I don't believe in divine inspiration, but I would be prepared to believe in evolving manuscripts.
Well, I would say,
Here's the problem with that ridiculous, illogical, irrational, unreasonable argument. How would you know it was truth if it emerged? What standard are you using to judge that there was even a change, right? So if truth isn't an eternal, unchanging concept, or set of concepts, or however you want to sort of parse that, right? If truth doesn't pre-exist and it emerges, which I'm perfectly happy to say that could be the case. This argument makes no difference in time, actually. Not all arguments are like that, but this one really doesn't make any difference because the core problems are the same. The core problems are all creation problems, right? Where did things start? So let's suppose, for example, that the core issue here is that truth emerged over time from a manuscript rather than being, quote, divine. I don't even know what that means. How would it have emerged? How would you measure the change of the truth through time to establish that it was A, truth, and B, more truthier than before? See how this quickly melts down into not being wordable? Like, language starts to fail. That's a good indication that you're on the wrong track, just to let you know. Not 100%, but also it's a good indication. So this doesn't make any sense because it can't be made any sense out of. Like, you can't make sense out of any of this line of, quote, reasoning because it's not reasonable. That's what it means to say it's not reasonable. It's not logical, and it's not rational. You can't say this unmeasurable thing that didn't exist, I am measuring against it and noticing a change in time and noticing its direction towards something that didn't and doesn't pre-exist. It's, first of all, actually all of that formulation is 100%, and I do mean all of it, 100% anti-scientific method. Which is kind of impressive if you think about it, because it's hard to kind of mistakenly, and maybe it's not a mistake, maybe it is, it's sort of hard to tell, like, did this guy think at all ever about anything? I've got my doubts. How he ran across this way. This doesn't make any sense and cannot ever be made any sense out of, no matter what you do. Like, where would you get these standards from? How would you measure the change? How do you know the change is going towards or away? Like, how do you do this? I'm genuinely curious. Right? But the smugness, the arrogance, which, Dawkins is nothing if not smug and arrogant, with which he talks about this, is amazing. And you'll notice that Peterson's actually doing quite a poor job of explaining what he means. There is a right thing here, which is to say the conversation hasn't ended, right? It seems to be what he's trying to say. The conversation has continued. He uses the word exploration. Excellent. I wish he'd talk more about exploration and tie that back to play, because that would be moving things forward, by the way, guys. Him and John Vervaeke both. Like, they got to get this nailed down. This is super important. But they're binary thinkers. They're dualists at heart. So I don't think they can manage it. But this idea of exploration is fantastically important, understanding human behavior. So when you look at what he's appealing to order. The order of the conversation is going a certain way. It's an ordered conversation. It hasn't broken down. All right. The problem with that argument is that now you're making a divine argument, actually. And I'll make the case for that in a second. You're making a divine argument about the nature of conversation and what a conversation looks like, and that the conversation has not ended, and that the ending that might happen is not negative. So you can see all the things you have to wrap up logically in that, right? Maybe that's not all of them. Don't ever let me give you the impression that I'm being complete and precise unless I say so specifically, because I'm not trying to be. I'm always trying to be, but I'm never certain that I am. I don't pretend like, I can figure out what all the variables. I definitely can't do that. I do my best, but I don't know how good it is. So we have a number of factors here. Should the conversation continue? And Peterson's presuming the answer to that is yes. That's a presumption, by the way. It hasn't been established. You can't establish that scientifically, would be my argument. He's also presuming that it's going well, which I would argue it's actually not, because Dawkins is just sitting there being smug and arrogant and angry and angrily resisting, very good points and questions. They're also not answering each other's questions very clearly in all cases. I'd say about half the time they are actually kind of being almost direct, and half the time they're not. Why shouldn't the conversation end now? Because actually, I wish it was over quite some time ago now, because they're not making any progress. So Peterson seems to think they're making progress. So this is the problem with, say, John Vervaeke's Dialogos, for example. They're not making any progress. Okay. Peterson is making progress. Maybe Alex is making progress. It's sort of hard to tell. He might be. I can't tell from this. He's not, that's not his role. He shouldn't be revealing that anyway. He's a moderator. So fair enough. Dawkins isn't making any progress right now. Maybe he will later, but he's certainly not making any progress right now. Now we've got some interest on one thing that Dawkins wants to talk about. Right? That Peterson, to be fair, I think takes for granted, because it's so bloody obvious that I don't know. I don't know why Dawkins is interested in this. It seems apparent, but whatever. Those standards that the conversation should continue, that it's good, that what's happening in the conversation now is good, and the way it should end, and the fact that it hasn't ended in one of those ways that isn't that, or isn't a number of those are questions of measurement of the highest ideal, divinity. Told you I'd get back there. So that's an appeal to the divine. And, again, I'd argue that Peterson's impressions of how this is going are very different from how it's actually going from, we'll say, the audience perspective. Because from everyone I've heard, there's no movement in this until the last 10 minutes. And there isn't so far. I'm not at the last 10 minutes. I got another, 20 minutes to go to see the last 10 minutes, or 22 minutes to go. But that seems to be a correct observation so far from what I've heard. And so Peterson's measurement is even to some extent flawed within his own set of definitions, as near as I can tell. Now, there's nothing wrong with that necessarily, but you see how these are all appeals to something higher. And why is it higher, Mark? What makes you use that word higher? Because it's unified. All of Peterson's appeals are unity appeals. We're still here talking. The conversation is moving in a direction that is good. Whatever good is, it's higher, right? It's moving towards something, or at least Peterson's moving towards something. That seems to be what he feels. It's that simple, guys. And Peterson can't see even that. He's already made that clear 3 separate times now, I believe. This is the problem. This is the problem you're fighting, the flat world materialism. And it's like the fact that we'll say Peterson is bumping up against it or trying to redeem it or something, which I think is very much what he's trying to do, is not an indication that he's able to break free from it. It's just an indication that he's stuck in a certain place and struggling with it. And you can see that struggle is good. That's fine. I don't have an opinion one way or another, but like, help the guy out. And you can't help him out with the advice you've been giving him, because you're misdiagnosing what's happening. And that's really the problem. Just flat out misdiagnosis of the problems that Peterson's actually struggling with. And why Dawkins is so keen to stay in the conversation is because Dawkins is just not seeing the point. And at this point, Dawkins is just fascinated. Why don't you see it my way, Jordan? That's how these people think. And it's very much, if you pay close enough attention, maybe you can't, and fair enough, not everybody can see it. You'll see it. You'll see it in his posture, in his eyes, and what he's saying, and how he's gesturing. I mean, he already did it once and pretty much said it like, yeah, so why don't you agree with me, bro? That's all there. And so that's why it matters whether or not it's divine, because that's the unity that's above you and good and true and beautiful, versus emergent, because emergence is a random, chaotic thing that may or may not manifest something that we may or may not interpret as order, by the way, because we are pattern finding machines. This has been proven experimentally, particularly in psychology. This is a little weird. These people can't put this stuff together. I don't understand. So we will see order where there is no order. We will see things as ordered and infer goodness or infer beauty or infer truth based on random events. Experimentally very solid findings in psychology. Or you could just observe and see this happen all the time. People like, oh yeah, I met this guy at the grocery store and we really hit it off. Okay, he's a wonderful person, right? And then 6 months later, oh yeah, it turns out he's a serial killer. No, really, that happened. This is a random example. But all flavors of that happen. Right? Oh, I went to this wonderful conference and I met all these great people. Right. And then you never built anything. Right. And these things happen. And because we read pattern in, we read order into randomness. And yeah, sure, the forces of non-unity, if there are such things, of course, there has to be a force of unity at some level. I love that. They love for you to be distracted. That's all they need. They don't need for you to agree with them or to get in bed with them or in league with them. They just need you to be distracted from the unity. And as long as you're distracted from the unity, all is well with them. They win. Don't let them win.
I would say this is why I had set forward the possibility of taking a look particularly at Mircea Eliade, because that's where you'd find the best work. He's brilliant. I believe that if you studied the history of religious ideas, it's a 3-volume manuscript, or The Sacred and the Profane, which is probably his single best work, that you'd see profound analogies between the manner in which you've been construing the world biologically, including the trains of thought that led you to the development of the idea of the meme. I really believe that.
Well, analogies is one thing, but is it the same thing?
I think it's the same. I do. I think, look, I don't know. That's why I'd like your opinion on it.
I love this. So let me just explain to you a small flaw in this line of quote reasoning. If there is a pre-existing reality, and science is the study of that pre-existing reality, then the findings that Peterson outlined are assumed, presumed, inevitable. Right. Because science does not, and cannot at all ever, even a little bit, even consider the possibility of even a little bitting, go after the concept of where did all that come from? Right? Why was there a pre-existing reality? Oh, it can't go after what is reality. Science is based on observation. And so it can say, oh, something happened. Oh, and it happened again. Oh, and it happened a third time. And then you get an idea about it. And then if that idea can be tested, and many can't, maybe most, by the way, then you can set up a test, and then you can validate reality. That's what science is. It's a form of validation. You know what else it is? Nothing. It's nothing, actually nothing else. I'm sorry. It really actually is nothing more than validation, right? And the way science, quote, proves things is non-existent. Science doesn't prove things. The primary mode by which science moves is disproving things. That's what it relies on. The absence of the ability to disprove something is scientific certainty. It's that simple. I'm very sorry that people are making much ado about almost nothing, but also this is almost nothing. It's very powerful in some sense, although not in any of the senses you've been sold. Guaranteed. 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 Okay? All of these things that people talk about without science we wouldn't have are almost all lies, for real. And I'm very sorry that I have to be the one to tell you that, but also true. And that's the problem. These people are trying to elevate their profession far beyond anything it has even a hope of being, far beyond it. And Peterson's made this point. Plumbers have saved more lives than doctors. Oh, I see. So people with degrees don't save lives. Right. Or at least they don't save more lives than people without degrees. That is correct. So why are we valuing degrees? I don't know. Fortunately, now we have so many people that we've shoved into college who don't belong there that the script is flipped, and plumbers make more money than PhDs, thankfully. Maybe that shouldn't be the case, by the way, but that's a different argument. So these are important things to notice, this pattern of the breakdown of the scientific institutional educational establishment, whether you go with the Eric Weinstein crazy theory about gatekeepers and all that, none of which is particularly wrong, it's just not causative, right? Or you go with some other thesis about the corruption of money within the system, or some people are talking about the addition of too many administrators corrupting, quote, pure science, which is a very Rousseauian argument ultimately, which cracks me up that everyone keeps making Rousseauian arguments and not realizing it. It doesn't really matter, right? Like, this happened. Right? And it continues to happen. And that's unfortunate. When you look at it historically, which they never do, they never really look at their own history. They're not very good flat worlders. They compress time. You realize that, yeah, when you separate the monasteries, which were classically the places of learning, from the church, and you, quote, secularize them, they work for a little while, maybe a couple hundred years, and then they crumble. That's a weird coincidence. But also that seems to be true. Like, I don't know what else to tell you. Like, just simple observation is like, weird correlation, bro. Yeah, weird. And if you take out all the much ado about nothing about science did this and science did that, when that didn't even happen, you start to realize, oh, this was never the thing it was touted to be to begin with. Also true. And I think that's where the problem comes in, is people want to believe this illusion about science that was never correct. It was always overblown propaganda in some sense. I don't really like the word propaganda, but also it seems appropriate here somehow. So we'll go with it. It just wasn't true. And I understand the struggle. I do. It took me a long time to come to terms with this. Hey, I got 1 A- in science once. I'm still angry about it, by the way. 1. It was really good at science. Science was really easy for me. Stupid snakes and their like jaw that opens up. Why didn't I get that question right? I don't know. A-. Me, A- in science. Really? Terrible. School system owes me, damn it. Even though I got the question wrong. I can hold a grudge. I bet you can't.
You know, well, seriously, like, it's a complicated question. It's a complicated question. Most people don't know both literatures. There's not a lot of people to discuss this sort of thing with. Camille Paglia, I talked to Camille Paglia about this. She studied the work of a man named Erich Neumann. Neumann wrote a book called Origins and History of Consciousness, which is a work of genius, and also another book called The Great Mother, which is a study of the symbolism of the feminine. It's a great book. Paglia told me that she believed that if the Academy would have turned to Erich Neumann, who's a student of Jung, although the greatest student of Jung, and maybe one who surpassed him, that the entire culture war that's torn the universities apart wouldn't have happened. People don't know this literature. And let me give you an example of this. You tell me what you think about this. Okay, so
I want to stop it right here and just make a couple points real quick. So I've harped on this before, but this is really important. The specialization of science is required to do science. I get that. I fully agree. Although when you shove too many people in science, you get too many, we'll say, smaller minds, right? Or incompetent minds. Maybe you could have a 130 IQ, and if you can't turn a wrench, you can't turn a wrench, right? And if you can't turn a wrench, there's certain types of experiments, by the way, you can't run. Oh, if all you can do is paper stuff, you're kind of confined to the realm of math mostly. You're not running lasers because you got to be able to spin a wrench to run a laser. And you can't rely on other people to do that necessarily because you're actually polluting the experiment. Right. This is the problem. So when you shove too many people in, you get smaller and smaller disciplines necessarily because those people, maybe they only have a 135 IQ, and maybe to do really good science at a certain layer where you're integrating enough of the other disciplines to make progress or something, or come up with good ideas, maybe at that point, you just can't have that many people in. I don't know. Almost certainly mathematically certain, by the way, but whatever. All I'm saying is I haven't run the math on that. And there are simulations that you could run to do that, by the way. And we have computers. So like you could run population samples. It wouldn't tell you that much, I would argue, because IQ is a horrible measure of absolutely anything. See Nassim Taleb's books. Just read them all. They're great. He talks about IQ in there a few times. But because of this, science has been splitting disciplines. Right. And because of that, it's missing what the other disciplines have to offer. And so there's just been this big like new discipline thing, right? So there's a bunch of these. It turns out in medical science, which I happen to know a little bit about because of my illness, it just turns out that the gastroenterologists are the closest to integrative medicine people that are still, we'll say, classically trained doctors. the integrative medicine people are now sort of coming to the fore, right? And they've got all kinds of interesting things. But there are more generalists than specialists. In the specialty fields, the gastroenterologists who understand systems, not the allergists, by the way, either. My gastro in Boston, who was one of the top 3 gastros in the world at the time, she was amazing, by the way. She just fixed me right up instantly. Just heard my first set of stories and went, I think I know what you have. And sure enough, she was right, gave me all the right meds. Didn't cure the problem, but, at least I wasn't like suicidally depressed anymore, that I was never going to be able to do anything again. That's always a plus, by the way, just in case you find yourself in that situation. She knew all this stuff and also hooked me up with a top allergist. It's always nice when you get to the top doctors, you get more top doctors. It's kind of how it works. Sorry, just how it works. That splitting, though, you see in all the sciences. And that's why you have a move in the academy now to reintegrate a bunch of different disciplines. Right. So neuroscience, right, is another of these integrative things where you're bringing a bunch of things together, right? A bunch of splintered disciplines back together, back into what would be a word for that, Mark? Oh, unity. Right. In other words, science has been moving down the stack to understand smaller and smaller emergences. And in that, it's missing the big picture. As this is inevitable, by the way. I'm not like, oh, science shouldn't have done this. It was going to happen, right? And now it has to like reintegrate those little disciplines back in to get anything good out. Right. Now, they're aimed at the wrong thing and they're trying to solve the wrong sorts of, quote, problems, if you will, right? They're trying to resolve things of philosophy, we'll say, although that's unfair because they're just wrong about what philosophy is, I would argue. They're trying to resolve religious questions using science with scientific levels of certainty. And what they're not understanding is that you can't do that. It's just that simple, like just constraint of the existence in which you exist. Sorry, bro. You were born into the world you were born into, thrown into it, if you want to get all crazy about it and use crazy, silly words for no apparent good reason. So that's part of the crisis in science, is that now you just have a bunch of isolated disciplines that don't know enough about the world anymore to be useful. They're too deep in the details to have anything good emerge. And science has been stuck there for decades at this point, for the most part. And that's why you have the replication crisis. You can't replicate things. You got too many incompetent people doing the work. That's not related to IQ, by the way. And there's too much work because there's way too many people trying to do this kind of work. And a lot of this stuff is, who cares? It's just flat out, who cares? A lot of people are chasing, I want to be the first person to, isolate skin cells and make them grow on their own. Why? Why is that science? I don't understand. Maybe if you want to replicate skin cells of an existing animal and use them for skin grafts, that's medically useful. Is that even science? Because it sounds like biological engineering to me. That would be useful. Useful things tend to be engineering, by the way. Little hint there. Now, whether or not we have too many engineers is a different question, also true, which will maybe we cover another video. If you want that video, let me know. I can maybe do a little bit of research into that and bring you some numbers or something. But this is the problem. And maybe, again, I think it was inevitable. I don't think science went down the wrong path. No, I think they would have had the same set of problems. I saw his talk with Paglia. It was quite good, by the way. It was a number of years ago now. Geez, probably 4 years old, something like that. It was quite a good talk. I don't think that's true, especially since science isn't a cohesive thing that, quote, went down a path. And I think that because no one, and I do mean almost nobody, Peterson especially, understands how these things actually unfold in a quote emergent world, because they don't emerge in that way, we'll say, they're missing what happened. So as I alluded to earlier, Dawkins changed a bunch of things in medicine for the worse. And now people are realizing that and going, man, we shouldn't have listened to Dawkins. His PhD thesis was garbage. I was just flat out wrong. And, his detractors are correct. Oops. And that questions his whole body of work, including this foolish meme thing. Like, what a ridiculous idea. I mean, if Peterson's right, memes were known before Dawkins because they're just archetypes. Sure, in a flat world, that would be true. Archetypes and memes would be undifferentiable or something, or so close it wouldn't matter or something. But we don't live in a flat world. Like, archetypes are the unity and memes are the splitting, roughly speaking. And it's not that simple, obviously, but also timeless things that last, right? Timeless patterns, right? Patterns of being and patterns of action are archetypal. That's what archetype means. Oh, well, that might be important, right? And that puts them strictly above and beyond us, both in time and in space. It's important that it's both axes, by the way. You have to expand things out and add a bunch of variables. That's really what enchantment is in scientific terms. It's not scientific, though, which is why it's hard. But yes, you have to go multivariate on this. And then once you go multivariate, you can't science it anymore because it's, to quote John Vervaeke, combinatorial explosion. Right. And now you're out of the realm of science entirely. Excellent. Now we can talk. Now we can give you symbols to unify things that are multivariate and combinatorially explosive. What do you think symbols are for, bro? That's what they're for, among other things, but that's what they do. Right. Now it all makes sense. These two are never going to make sense of it. They don't understand what I just outlined. And fair enough, a lot of people don't. And maybe you don't have to. But if you're not going to understand that, maybe you shouldn't be slavish to things like science. What should you be slavish to? Well, not science.
I spent a fair bit of time studying the psychophysiology of the hypothalamus. Okay, so the hypothalamus is set up, it's got two halves, basically. One half deals with fundamental motivated states, hunger, thirst, defensive aggression, sexuality, and so forth. And when those areas are dominated, the biologically relevant goal is activated and perceptions are oriented towards that goal. Okay, so now then you might ask yourself, well, what happens if all those biologically motivated states are satiated? And the answer seems to be is that the other half of the hypothalamus kicks in and it mediates exploratory behavior. And so the default structure of the mammalian nervous system is, if satiated or in doubt, explore and gather new information. There's no difference between that and hero mythology. They are the same thing. They're the same thing. The dragon fight, for example, which is the oldest story we have. It's coded in the Mesopotamian mythology. The dragon fight story is explore the dangerous unknown, discover the treasure that revitalizes the community. There's no difference between that and the science that you practice. They're the same thing.
What do you think of that,
It's the
Richard?
same story.
That is a fascinating thesis. I don't know why Peterson, as a psychologist, doesn't add that into the psychology side of things, right? Psychology tends to speak in terms of, away from pain and towards pleasure, which is total nonsense and completely debunked. I don't know why Peterson's using hero mythology here. I think in a flat world, it's all heroes all the way down for these people, because when unique persons transform into individuals, or you try to transform a unique person into an individual, because you're not an individual, you can't be an individual, right? That's just an absurd way to speak about the world. And there's no, like, it's a flat world, then every individual is a hero. They would have to be, sure, because you can't have a hierarchy there. It's weird that Peterson talks about hierarchy and exploration and doesn't really integrate them well into the other things he's talking about. It's usually the problem that you run into with these people who have a high IQ, unfortunately, is that they're not very good at linking things together, which was the complaint he made earlier about science. Weird. It's almost like it's a self-similar fractal pattern all the way up and down or something. Nah, can't be that. So it's interesting that he's just flat out saying, no, that's the same thing as what you're doing with biology. I think he's 3 steps too far, and Dawkins won't get it. So let's see.
I don't know what to make of that. I mean, you say they're the same story. You analogized the dragon fight to
Well, how many
fighting
dragons have
Satan.
you overcome in your life?
I'm not interested in dragons. I'm interested in reality.
Okay, so let's okay. So I read a book a while back that described the biological reality of the dragon. Say, well, there's no such thing as a dragon. It's like, okay, is there such a thing as a predator?
Of course.
Well, that's a meta category. What's the category of predator? Bear, eagle, if you're a primate. Fire? Is fire a predator?
No.
Well, it's complicated because a fire kills you. Okay, so is there a worse predator than serpentine, flying, fire-breathing reptile? Is that not the imagistic equivalent of predator? So in what way, if predator is real, in what way isn't dragon real? It doesn't take that much imagination to see the identity. And then wouldn't the fundamental task of edible primates be to figure out how to overcome the dragon forever?
I don't know.
So, as predicted, Dawkins didn't get it. It's too many leaps. So when people talk about allegories or analogies or metaphors, those are usually layers of abstraction. That's what they're actually referring to, I would say, at least in, quote, secular speak. And if you give people too many layers of abstraction to deal with, they can't handle it, especially if, they're not the brightest bulbs on the tree, or they don't have a strong symbolic way of understanding the world, because symbolism does unify between layers of abstraction. That's actually what it does. It resolves vertical causality, roughly speaking, among other things. I'm not trying to reduce it. And so you can see kind of the flat world. Well, I don't understand why those are the same thing. And then Peterson does a pretty good job of outlining it. Right. What's the meta category? Well, what is a meta category? I hate the use of the word meta. See my video. I have a video on why you shouldn't use that word. This is a prime example, by the way, but it'll probably work in this scenario just because they're roughly speaking the same language. In this case, meta means abstracted. The abstract category, right? The abstract would have been a much better word here, by the way. The abstract category of predator, you might as well swap the word predator for dragon. Sure, I agree. That would probably work in abstraction. And I think Dawkins' problem is he wants to talk about, quote, reality, again, without defining it, because this is always their trick, right? And he's just not interested in things that don't talk about reality. And it would be, okay, what is reality, bro? And he can't answer that question. We already know he can't answer that question. So you might as well ask it. Watch him squirm.
Why you say dragon? I mean, we have lions, we have tigers, we have saber-tooths, we have
Why not
tyrannosaurs
abstract?
out there.
Right, but why not abstract? Because it's for the same reason that we have the term predator. Like we have the term bear, lion, Komodo dragon. Well, you make an amalgamation, you say, well, the relevant set of features is an image. Well, what's the image? Predator as such. What's the image of that? The dragon that never disappears. And then there's a twist on that, which is so cool. It's so interesting because you can imagine rabbit mythology, which would be something like predator appears, freeze. But that's not the human story. The human story is predator appears, there's a treasure somewhere, right? That's a completely different pathway of evolutionary significance. Like the way that we construe the world isn't freeze like predator. It's like, oh, there's a predator. Maybe there's something valuable lurking in our conflict with it. You know, our sticks and our spears that enable our fragile bodies to stand up against the dragons of the world.
So a dragon is a pictorial representation of the abstracted concept of a predator.
Yes.
As you say, we already have the term predator. And so it might be useful in art, in narrative, to, I mean, you can't paint an abstraction.
We had the image way before we had the word.
Sure, okay. But
No, but that's a seriously important thing to understand.
But now we have the word. We have the word predator. And maybe if we were doing art, maybe if we were all going to sort of draw a picture or tell a story, and we wanted to invent a story to give our children a good moral message, we might invent this dragon or use this dragon as...
Well, we do, always. We
Sure.
do it continually.
Exactly, we do.
We do it with Harry Potter.
But-
we do it with The Lord of the Rings. We do it with the Avengers.
But when you
there's no
say...
escaping from it.
Okay, I gotta stop it here. This is the flat world compression of time. Alex doesn't understand which came first and why that's important, and then he reverses the order. Did you see that he reversed the order? He said, well, we have Predator, and then we have this imagistic, and Peterson had already told him, no, the image comes first, and that's important. And you can tell it passes right over him. And this is why, my friends, that I can always tell when somebody's hooked in. I can always tell whether or not they're like on the same level. Like, did you get it or not? Alex didn't get it. And maybe he can't, which I think is correct. And you may say, Mark, you can't derive that. No, I can derive that. Because he reversed the order like it was nothing after being told it matters. So either he can't physically hear, I suppose that's theoretically possible, or he can't listen correctly, also possible, right? Or he can hear and listen, but he couldn't actually understand the point for whatever reason. There's lots of reasons that could be true, right? It could be cognitively overloaded. That wouldn't be hard being around Peterson, man. I think I'd probably get cognitively overloaded listening to Peterson too much. It could be that those concepts aren't available to him. That's actually more likely. I can't say that with certainty, but also, boy, there's a lot of evidence that he just doesn't conceptually understand the importance of sequence as such. The idea of sequence, not this sequence, sequence. I know it's hard for people who understand sequence and the importance of sequence to imagine a world where people don't, but actually we're living in that world. This is why there's all this confusion around politics and stuff. Why don't these people see? They know this evidence exists. They've accepted the evidence and they won't accept the conclusion. Maybe they can't. It's like, because they probably actually can't. And there could be multiple reasons for that. But one of the reasons, and probably the most likely, is that they don't have the mental capacity, whatever that is, because it has nothing to do with IQ, my friends. I assure you that. They just don't have the mental capacity to do that. And that's the problem. And you could argue, well, they can do some things in sequence. Yes. And if they learned things in sequence and they didn't derive the importance of sequence, which happens all the time, by the way, that's why rote memorization exists. That's why you can train people to work in factories sometimes, but you can't train them to manage even objects because they can't actually think, but they can be trained in rote repeating behaviors. I'm sorry, there are people like that. Peterson's talked about one of them before who couldn't even be trained to stuff envelopes, the poor guy. There are people like that. I don't know how many there are and all the different levels and how many there are at each level, but we need to start thinking about that very seriously. And this is why equality doctrines fail, because you make too many assumptions based on one or two facts about a person, of what they can and cannot handle in their lives. A lot of people can't handle living on their own at all. So it's better that they live in their parents' basement than they try to live on their own, because it just causes a lot of havoc. I've seen this. This is not uncommon at all. by the way. We can talk about whether or not they could be rehabilitated to live not in their parents' basement. Or we could just make sure they don't have to live alone because they have a mate, for example. That might be easier, in fact. That also might have costs that we don't particularly care for or something. But maybe it doesn't matter what we care for. Maybe it matters what's best for the largest number of people, say, in the culture. That might be more important. And this is all wrapped up in this conversation. And if you don't see it right away, that's fine. Maybe review this section. This is all the same issue, for real. We're just not appreciating. Alex cannot think about sequence and the importance of sequence on the fly. Even if he's told it's important, he ignored it completely right there. This is not uncommon. I have seen this millions of times with people in conversations where they don't actually understand the point. And I say, no, that's actually really important. But they can't make the connection between that and any other thing. This is not uncommon. Lots of people have this limitation, irrespective of IQ, irrespective of other skills. And we don't understand this, but there's a prime example of it. I don't care what Alex's IQ is. I don't care that he went to Oxford. I don't care what degree he has. That's a whopping mistake. And he literally reversed it and said, oh, we have Predator, and then we put it into children's stories as dragons. And Peterson just told him, no, we had dragons first. And anybody who can think about it and took the time to think about it knows that that has to have been true, because pictographic representation came before written language. Period. Before. The sequence matters. So he can't even derive an observable, obvious sequence at all. This is a big problem. It's not a little problem. And it's not necessarily correctable. I would like to think that it is. I'm sure you already are hoping that it is. But I don't know that that's true. I have lots of evidence that it's not true. Right. Super important to realize. So on the one hand, I feel bad that he made the mistake. On the other hand, I'm absolutely thrilled that I get to point this out, because it's fantastically important that you understand how fantastically important that is. There are lots of people like that we have given advanced degrees to who can't figure this out. There are thousands upon thousands of people right now, maybe even one or more of the people in this conversation, who actually don't seem to understand that language and thought are not the same thing, and that you don't need language to think, even though Helen Keller existed. And in fact, that case was a breakthrough case at the time because it demonstrated exactly that. There is zero correlation between your use of language and your intelligence. Actually none. Oops. And yet, when we hear an articulate person like Dawkins or like Sam Harris, see my videos on Sam Harris if you haven't. They're quite good. We tend to infer some level of intellectual prowess that is completely unwarranted in many cases. This is fantastically important. This is the most important thing about this talk, and about what my commentary is about, and about what my channel is about. I'm not trying to enchant you with articulation, although you might have gotten the idea that I well could if I so chose, because I probably can. But I don't want to. I'd rather convince you my way, instead of using enchantment on you in that way. I don't like verbal enchantments. I don't like tonal enchantments. I'm quite not a fan. See my videos on Sam Harris. Yeah, it's all there, right? And so this is important to note. There's way more variability in human intellectual capacity than you realize. And certainly than any of these three realize. Like, I don't think they know what the others of them don't know, even though to me it's like, wow, you can't see this. And fair enough, most people don't seem to be able to. And for that, I apologize. Had I known you all didn't know, I'd have done this decades ago, because this stuff shines like the sun to me. And I got trained in the furnaces of very smart people in Boston for sure. And I've been around some real intellects. I mean, Peterson's pretty smart for sure. Also, drooling moron compared to some of the people I know and have known. Right. I've known some really smart people. I've known people with unrecorded IQs and stuff. And it's like, I don't even know how to tell you how smart they were, because I can't figure it out. Way, way smarter than any of these guys. Way smarter than any public intellectual you've seen. Way smarter. Light years. Those guys are drooling morons compared to these people. They are unbelievably bright. Most of them have social anxiety too. A few of them don't. And occasionally you'll meet one that actually can explain things to you in spite of, your lack of information or knowledge or education or whatever, which is just a treat and a joy and amazing and probably a miracle, right? And so, maybe that's why I have the ability to see this so clearly and other people don't. But this is whoppingly important. And it's important that you realize you are also limited in those ways, as am I. And that's why you're so confused by these sorts of commentaries, talks rather, and why you need commentaries on them, because you don't know why they're not making any progress. It's not clear to you. It's totally clear to me, right? You don't understand why you're getting a bad feeling from this, or why you suddenly feel like Alex seems to be making progress when in fact he's just ruined any progress he made right there, right? It's because of agreement. It's because of our need to see order in a chaotic world. And so the order that we see is much greater than the order that is there in all cases, in all circumstances, with very few exceptions. And those exceptions we would call divine experiences. That's how we describe them now. The most cynical and scientistic among us still do that to this day. It's a very mysterious thing, right? It's almost like we can sense the alignment in the self-similar practicality of the universe when it happens, and we're open to it, or something. But alas, I digress. Let's continue.
When you say the biology of a dragon, you must understand how that can be misleading as to the enterprise that you're engaging in, because we're talking here about narrative, we're talking here about art, we're talking here about representations in literature.
I don't think the category of dragon is any less valid than the category of lion.
Any less biological?
Well, it depends on your level of analysis. We have the term predator, which implies that all predators have something in common, because otherwise we wouldn't have the term. It's like there's no reason to assume ontological priority for the category of lion over the category of predator. Mm-hmm. Like it depends on all that would determine which of those terms should be used is the purpose towards which the conceptualization is being directed.
Bingo! This is brilliant. Thank you, Dr. Peterson. Finally. Yes. Final cause matters. Make final cause great again. Telos matters. The telos determines the priority of the hierarchy. Determines the correct ontology. Why, yes. Yes, it does. The ancient Greeks knew this, by the way, but whatever. We're rediscovering it now. I guess here we are. That's fine. Or you could have read Plato. But anyway, now you would have misunderstood everything he wrote and probably read the allegory of the cave incorrectly, see my video, and thought it was some individualistic story of breaking free from the system, which is almost exactly the opposite of what Plato's saying in book 7. Anyway, yes, this is the important part. And yet, Peterson doesn't see the implications of this. Where does that telotic, right, telos, come from that determines the ontology? Right, because that has to be outside of science. He's already gone over this. Okay. So now I would argue that's not philosophy. That's outside of philosophy. Because philosophy is the bucket of ontologies according to the ancient Greeks. I'm going to die on that hill all day long. I think it's great. We're in the realm of religion. What is your purpose? Oh, I care about not being eaten by a predator. Why? You're a worthless human who lives in his basement, like his mom's basement. Why do you care? Right. If you're nihilistic, you don't care. Wait a minute. If I'm nihilistic, I don't care if I get eaten by the lion, and therefore the lion category isn't actually all that important. Is it a lion that eats me, or a bear, or a bus that runs me over? Really doesn't matter. They can all be predators in that case. Wait, it doesn't matter. Why? Because I'm nihilistic. But nihilism isn't a scientific thing. No, it's not. It's a religious thing. Oh, vertical causality to the rescue. Right. Hierarchy requires vertical causality. Right. When you are creating an ontology, you have presumed the hierarchy. You've presumed the vertical causality without stating it, and you can't prove it scientifically. Boy, that explains a lot now, doesn't it? And we've already stated most of this, by the way. Peterson's already pointed all this out in the conversation to date. Yes, this is actually really important. This is actually the fundamental breakdown of the scientific project right here. You can't accept predator or lion or bear and reject dragon. It's impossible, especially not in a flat world, which is what Peterson asserts. I don't care. It makes no difference if it's top down or bottom up. Flat world indeed.
If you want to identify a particular class of predator, well, then lion is a good term.
You would say that lions are an instantiation of this bracket term of predator.
Well, I would also say...
Would you therefore say that a lion is an instantiation of the bracket term of dragon?
Yes.
That wasn't hard. Was that hard? That didn't seem hard, Alex. I love instantiation came up. I use this term all the time, by the way. It's also very useful in computers. Like when you're talking about object-oriented systems, programming methodologies, you have objects, which are abstractions, and instantiations, which are, or instances, right? Right. So all of that was co-opted from science, by the way, right? But these are all fundamentally religious themes at the end of the day, because it matters what you're using it for, which is the exact point. But at least Alex can understand it at that level. Why he can't get the whole thing in his head, again, I don't know. But there it is.
Yes, because, see, because we're not only fact-oriented creatures, right? It actually matters to us whether we get eaten. Like it's one thing to lay out the nomenclature of the animal kingdom, but it's another thing to remember that predators can eat you. And then it's another thing, and this is very interesting, and it's relevant to that story of the bronze serpent. It's like, what do we want to teach our children? Well, to identify predators, obviously. Well, what do we want to teach them more profoundly? What attitude they should take towards the eternal fact of the predator. And the attitude they should take is something like the courage to voluntarily confront, and not to run away, and not to hide, and not to freeze, and not to casually demonize, but to assume that in the combat with the eternal predator, an eternal treasure might be found. And that's exactly what you do, whether you know it or not, when you teach a child to be courageous. And we know from the psychological literature that generalizes. And I do think it's identical with the mechanism of learning in human beings, because kids, us, we always learn on the edge. You know, in your own life, you know, and I don't want to be presumptuous, but no doubt there have been situations where you've been battling to have your ideas distributed, even to modify your own conceptions when you had something new to learn. That's a sacrifice. You have to kill your stupidity so that you can move forward. That's what happens in the story of Abraham, by the way, when he makes sequential sacrifices. So in the story of Abraham, you tell me what you think about this.
Wow. Peterson's dragging in a lot of stuff here. None of it's wrong, by the way. This is great. I love this part. This is fantastic. But you can see his struggle. And you notice he has two categories, the now and the eternal. And there's nothing in between. Flat world indeed. So he's not wrong, but he's using a one-dimensional abstraction instead of a multi-dimensional abstraction to describe everything. And so that's what I mean. Like, he's bumping up against the edge of materialism, against the edge of the flat world, because those are the same thing at some level, right? They're not analogous in that way, but they're the same thing at some level, right? All materialism is going to create a flat world, and all flat worlds are going to reduce to materialism eventually. He's bumping up against that, and he can only create another category, the eternal. Right? And so his world's not enchanted yet, guys. It's not enchanted yet. He hasn't been able to self-enchant his world. No shock there yet. So he understands the symbols, but he's relating the symbols to the eternal. And yes, but necessary, but insufficient. And I would argue there's a lot of symbols that don't relate to the eternal. They relate to, we'll say, the local patterns, local changes, local cycles, right? Not eternal cycles, not eternality as such. And that's, for me, where the breakdown is, and why he can't make the progress that we'll say everybody's hoping that he can make. It's that flat world, dualistic, eternal, and the now system that he's not accounting for. And you also notice everything is now and eternal. And like, he didn't know that he doesn't mention the past, but it's never like the past to now to eternal, because now you've got two change possibilities, right? Which would give you two cycles, and they're cycles, right? And he almost touched on the difference between categorization, which is a concretization, and action, which is a participation. Those concepts would help him a lot, I think. I could be wrong. Maybe he wouldn't understand any of it. But that's actually the real difference, is the concrete thing, right? The thing you can count on or have certainty over, predator, right? Versus the being eaten, which is the action, which is the participation. It's a negative participation if you're the thing being eaten, by the way, just in case that wasn't clear. Now, we are also predators. This is where it all breaks down, right? Is that, you change perspectives and suddenly your relationship is predator, and now that story breaks down immediately. Right. This is why Peterson's not close. Right, because once you change perspectives, you're screwed. Like, his outline doesn't work anymore because it's not symbolic. Because he's still struggling in the flat world, in the dualism. And that's why you get the feeling that even he isn't making progress, because at one level he's not. Right? I mean, he's still changing and moving and struggling and doing good work in that way, but he's really still stuck. And you can go a long time and be stuck and make, say, incremental progress without having the breakthrough. You could die that way. Most people do. I'm just saying that would be unfortunate if it happened in this case, for sure, because there's a lot of potential here for Peterson to do a lot more good with a slight language upgrade. But it's not a mere language upgrade. There's a conceptual set of ways of thinking that have to happen for that language to make sense. And just because the conception happens doesn't mean you can link it to the language. Like, people are complicated. There's a lot going on in people's heads. I would love to think, and I do very much believe, that he could do it. Like, he could just pull it off. Right? But I have no basis for that. It's quite possible that he's at his limit. And maybe he's even past it. I don't know. There's indications of that too, which makes it very scary. And that's fine. Like, that would be fine. what he's doing, if he just keeps doing it, and I might argue that he's not, he's straight away. But what he was doing, particularly with maps of meaning, if he just kept doing that, that does a lot of good for the world. Now, is there way more that needs to be done beyond that? Yes, absolutely there is. But other people should do that, or other institutions should do that. And that's why I don't think things like Peterson Academy are necessarily going to save the world. I talked about that on my John Vervaeke talk there, which most of that should be out by now. We'll see. We'll see how my release schedule goes. I'm falling behind on release because of colds and funerals and having to drive halfway across the United States, little things. So this flat world struggle is right here. Right. And you can see him dragging more stuff in. So this is why these conversations get confusing, because they keep dragging in new concepts. And now Peterson's doing it. Dawkins was doing it before. Now Peterson's doing it.
Because it staggered me when I understood it. Abraham is a protected person. He doesn't have to lift a finger. He lives in the socialist utopia. He's got everything delivered hand to mouth. He's at home till he's 70. And God comes to him as the voice of adventure, which is something remarkable to see, and says, you leave your zone of comfort and go out into the world, have your terrible adventure. And Abraham says, yes. And then a series of cataclysms occurs around him, just like it does in every adventurous life. And every time an episode concludes, he makes a sacrifice. Why? To get rid of what's stupid and old about him, so that he can progress and transform. And that happens to such a degree that he gets a new name, which means he's changed so dramatically he's not even the person he used to be. And that's a consequence of following that adventurous pathway. And that's all coded in the story.
What a brilliant outline. All true. I don't know how well that's going to be relatable to what he just said, even though it is. Like, it's nothing. Like, Peterson's just on his game here, right? He's playing perfect Peterson pool or whatever. He's bang on. I love this. I love Peterson this way. I do. I'm not sure how effective it will be. So it'll be interesting to see, because right where I happen to posit how these things happen, I really don't. I'm glad they do, though. Very grateful. You can see sort of the flare of curiosity in Dawkins here, and that it's a wonder. And I don't know what he's wondering about. Wondering, is this man mad? Or is he wondering, like, what am I missing? Or is he wondering, oh, isn't this interesting? I don't know. Let's find out.
I think we just have to agree that we have different kinds of minds, and you're interested in symbols, and I'm interested in facts. I mean, let's take predators. I mean, predators, I'm fascinated by predators. Predators are, the relationship between predators and prey is an arms race, an evolutionary arms race. And whenever you see a really complicated, beautifully designed piece of biology, what Hume, I think, one of Hume's characters called things that ravish into admiration, or all who contemplate them. This is almost certainly the result of an arms race, probably between predators and prey, could be between parasites and hosts. Mm-hmm. And so if we are talking about adaptations to just the climate, woolly rhinoceroses grow hair because it's getting cold. That's relatively boring. Mm-hmm. But when it's an adaptation to a predator, then you get an escalation of adaptations by prey, which are countered by predators, which are countered by prey, so you get a gradual escalation. Now that's interesting. That explains why you have animals that run fast, why they have keen sense organs, why they have teeth, why they have sharp teeth, why they have behavior patterns that either protect them from predators, or if they're predators, help them to catch prey. The idea of the arms race is the thing that grabs me. The arms race between, nothing to do with dragons and mythology.
I would like to stop it here and just point out a bunch of things. This this idea of arms race is not established scientifically or experimentally in evolutionary biology or otherwise. Oops. So, anti-scientific. Also, we have one, we'll call it cyclical constraint called nature that moves very slowly. And then we're comparing that with an interface between two complex animals. Of course that's different. One's quicker than the other. That's all. It's just a speed change at the end of the day. That's all. I don't think that's really fascinating. Actually, it's kind of boring. So I'm like puzzled by this. Secondly, that story's wrong. Yeah. It turns out that actually a lot of times the predator and or the prey have the qualities they need to become better before they need it. This is actually in the evolutionary literature as a mystery. So I don't know what the hell he's talking about here. He's just wrong. I don't know what else to say. Yeah, it's wrong. And we know that's wrong from the fossil record. Don't know what to tell you about that. It's just wrong. So, yeah. Also, we're not dealing with cases where that doesn't work. Right? So this is a very, like, you want to understand progressivism. By the way, I have a video on the lie of progress. This is a good example of the lie of progress right here. In almost all cases, that doesn't happen. One wipes out the other. Either the predators get wiped out because the prey start escaping and they starve, or the predators wipe out the prey. That's almost always what happens. Almost always. In other words, the case that he's talking about, the case of progress, is an unusual miracle. That's the best way to say it, actually, technically speaking. Right. That's important to know. You probably don't know enough evolutionary theory or biology or science to realize any of that. Fair enough. I actually looked into all this. Clearly, I've researched this before many times, many, many years ago too. Hasn't changed. It's only gotten worse. That picture, that story I just told you, man, that evidence has been piling up for like 35 years. Right. I've watched it. I've been like, oh yeah, there's another instance where they found this, and they're like, oh, wait a minute. Right. And the other thing is, we're talking, when we're talking about evolution, we're talking about very long time scales, which is weird for somebody who in the conversation doesn't seem to account for time at all. Right. These arms races are, thousands of years, millions of years in some cases, depending upon how you look at them. Wait a minute. Go back. Depending upon how you... Right. What do you mean by arms race? Right. Because, look, and I've heard this, but like, I don't make this stuff up. I hear this from other places. You could say that the arms race between the types of creatures on the planet has currently been won by the mammals. Previously, the dominant types of species on the planet were reptiles. We called them dinosaurs. And now they're mammals because the reptiles got wiped out. Now, I think this is a silly game to play, but I heard somebody play it once and I was like, well, that's a funny perspective. I kind of like it. It's silly and weird, right? And so the apes rose up from that milieu, if you will. Okay, so on the predatory scale, oh, wait a minute. Was the predator in that case the Earth? Was that due to climate change? Or was it a space rock? Could it have been aliens that sent the space rock? See how you get into trouble real quick at scale, real quick. And that's the problem. Is that a predator issue? Did evolutionary survival happen due to a random natural circumstance? You can't talk about it this way. It doesn't make any sense. It doesn't work. None of this works. This evolutionary framework is non-functional at these layers of discussion. It's functional for a bunch of things, kind of. I mean, depending upon your definition of functionality, which, depends on your telos, your final cause. But when you start talking about it, outside of a stated intent, a final cause, it's gobbledygook nonsense talk. And it can be sliced and diced and changed any way you want. And you can go, the postmoderns had a point. No, they didn't. It's a trick. It's literally a trick. It's a trick. Yes, if you don't have a telos, you can insert anyone you want. No kidding. If you don't have a particular fact, you can insert any fact in its place. Also true. These are not whopping great philosophical concepts or wonderful intellectual leaps, guys. This is known by 3-year-olds and talked about by them in that way all the time. So, sure. Why is that? Why is this predator-prey thing so fascinating? Just change the perspective and the predator and prey switch. Because every prey is a predator to something else. It's just a matter of perspective. Oops. Did I make a great postmodern point? Did I surpass the great Foucault? No. This is banal and boring and easy. It's a Captain Obvious moment. So the question is, why is a Captain Obvious moment interesting to Dawkins? That's a better question to ask.
Fair enough, right? And I share your appreciation for that remarkable, the remarkable phenomena that emerge in consequence of that. Okay, so let's take the idea of arms race. All right, so here's how I would construe what I said in what I think might be your terms.
Okay.
All right, we transformed the battle with the predator into a meme battle. We abstracted it so that we could figure out how to deal not with a predator, but with the class of all possible predators. Right, exactly. And the appropriate way to deal with the class of all possible predators is something like a meta-ethic. It's a stance that, let me give you an example of this. We actually know something about this psychophysiologically. And you can look at it spiritually or physically, and it doesn't matter. So, for example, if you take people in psychotherapy and they're accidentally exposed to something they're afraid of, they have a stress response that's damaging if it's sustained, and they become more frightened. But if you expose them to exactly the same stressor, and they do it voluntarily, they manifest an entirely different pattern of psychophysiological activation. Okay, and it's a stance of challenge, right, and not of fear. All right, and so one of the things that you're doing in psychotherapy when you get people to expose themselves to, you could say predators, because that's an accurate way of dealing with it, is that you get them to shift into a mode of voluntary confrontation instead of prey-like apprehension and retreat. And what they learn from that is that they can embody that pattern, which I would call a spirit metaphysically. They can embody that, they can practice it. It's also the case, there's some evidence that there's epigenetic consequences of that. If you practice that process of voluntary confrontation with the terrible unknown, it can catalyze transformations that reach all the way down into the cellular. And so we abstracted the fight with the predator into the imaginal space. We play out various tactics. Some of them are conserved and transmitted. They adapt themselves to the structure of human memory, and they make the foundation for our most fundamental narratives. Look, you know, the reference I made to Harry Potter, the reference I made to The Lord of the Rings and to the Avengers, these aren't casual references. You know, we spend most of our computational, high-end computational power generating fictional worlds where we can portray meme battles so that everyone can observe them.
Yes.
All right. Wow. I'm going to stop it there, and I'm going to stop the video here because it's been a long time. So we're at 2 hours, just about. There's no such thing as a meta ethic. It's just an ethic. Why are we dividing ethics? I don't understand this move at all. Like, ethic is the abstracted class. It doesn't make any sense. Why? Make it stop. Make it stop. See my video on metaphysics. It's no such thing. That was great. Again, you can see the flat world there, right? he probably should have stuck to, if somebody's afraid of lions and you exposed them to a lion, right? I mean, he should. Materialists really need the material examples. That might have worked a little bit better had he kept it like at that layer, tying it to epigenetics and genetic changes. Brilliant. That's what he needed to do. And so he probably should have left out the spiritual and the meta, whatever. He should have left all that out. And he would have done a better job. He would have said, look, there's a psychological way that you can prep yourself such that an exact same material encounter has the opposite effect. And when it's the opposite effect, at the very least, although I think it goes in both directions, I don't know, it changes your genetic structure. Right, because that establishes two things. It establishes the connection he made later, which is, oh, we do that in our heads, so we don't have to do it in real life. That is actually an orthogonal point. He probably shouldn't even go down that road in that way. This is the problem with psychology. They like to stray back into the fantasy land. That's actually hurting us as a culture. We get too many people living in the fantasy land instead of in the real world with other people, for example. Or they're living in a world outside their head, but that only involves them as a person, and they can't tell where they end and other things begin. Right. But the other thing that allows you to do is that once you establish that your attitude towards the predator changes your genes, you establish the mind-body connection. And that's important because now you flip the script on the materialists and you say, no, the genes don't control us. Our thoughts control the genes, at least to some extent. That move destroys all of these people. There's nothing, they have no counter to that whatsoever. It doesn't, because a counter doesn't exist logically, reasonably, and rationally. There isn't one mathematically. You can't map it out. Doesn't work. That's actually the better move. That's the move that I use. I say, oh, okay, so basically you're admitting to me that your thoughts change your actions, and therefore, I mean, obviously you have to do a little more work than that, but like Peterson's work would have been great at that level. And had he stuck to really good material examples, I think it would have landed harder. Now, it's quite possible that even doing that, Dawkins and Alex would remain completely unmoved because they do seem to be the immovable objects in this conversation, as I pointed out earlier. But I'm tired, so we'll find out next time. Join me for part 4, which definitely will be the last part, and probably will unfortunately be yet another 2 hours, although hopefully not. Hopefully I can close it off in an hour or something. But look, this is painful for me. I do not like listening to any of this. There are parts like I pointed out that actually I rather enjoy. But watching Oconner and Dawkins is painful. And watching when Peterson stumbles and struggles is also painful for me. So look, if you like this, support my work, support the channel, like, subscribe, all that stuff. Look at some of my other videos. I've talked about this theme many times, or these themes, many times in many other videos. I've got like 2.5 years of videos here. So, feel free, browse, come into a live stream, join me, right? But most of all, what I want you to take away from this is there are missing concepts, and that's what people are struggling with. And we haven't seen that. And we haven't noticed some people are living in a flat world, and they just don't understand this stuff. Even Peterson, the great man himself, is struggling with this mightily, putting up a mighty fight, for sure. But there's no sort of hand wave magic wand solutions here, and that's a big problem. But the best solution is for you to take a good care, as I think you have done in watching my video, with your time and attention.